Welcome to the first episode of Southern Discomfort. I'm your host, Bobby Caruso, with my partner,
Bob Walker.
Bob. Who is that you have?
This is Lucky, our unintended guest from the introductory episode.
As you all recall, Lucky was in the background quite a bit. He is our new mascot.
All right, bud, fly away and be quiet.
Fly away. Behave.
Be quiet.
Remember, we're in the South. Our first episode is going to be entitled The Case of the Headless Assassin. It's one of the most famous cases in American history, although the individual that we're investigating is not one of the most famous individuals in American history. Before we head out, Bob, to the beautiful town of Geneva, Florida, and the Geneva Cemetery to continue our investigation, Bob is going to give us a little background on the case you're about to see. Bob, let us know what's going on.
Well, everyone knows about John Wilkes Booth assassinating President Lincoln at Ford's Theater in 1865.
Absolutely.
What a lot of people don't know is that he had a team of co-conspirators who were involved in multiple assassinations. If you've ever seen the movie The Godfather, where Michael Corleone takes out a bunch of mafia bosses at the end of the movie.
Are you saying that because I'm Italian?
Yeah, me too.
I know. Go ahead.
But Booth had something similar in mind, where he wanted to basically decapitate the government by taking out the president, the vice president, and the Secretary of State at the same time. And he assigned Lewis Powell, which this episode is about, to assassinate the Secretary of State, William Seward, at his home. And just a little background on Powell. He was born in Alabama. His family eventually ended up in Florida, where he enlisted in the Confederacy at the age of 17. Fights in a lot of battles.
Famous battles.
Famous battles. And he's wounded at Gettysburg. He ends up becoming a Union prisoner. He ends up escaping from a prison hospital, where he goes to Virginia and joins Mosby's Rangers, which was a very famous Confederate regiment or cavalry group. And sometime after that, he ventures up into the Baltimore, D.C. area, where he becomes embroiled in Booth's plot to assassinate the president. Now, at the time, originally, they were going to kidnap Lincoln. They weren't going to kill him.
Correct.
But after Robert E. Lee's army surrenders at Appomattox on April the 9th, the plot develops from a conspiracy to kidnap to an assassination plot. And Lewis Powell is given the assignment by Booth to go to the home of Secretary William Seward and to kill him there in his home. And on the night in question, Seward goes to the house. He's there with a man named Davy Herold. Herold knows the city. Powell not so much so. And Herold's duty is to basically, after Powell goes in the home and assassinates the Secretary of State, to get him out of there. Just get him.
Like a getaway driver.
Right. Exactly. Well, they get outside the house, and Powell notices there's a lot of activity in the house. There's nurses, there's military personnel, there's family. And so he decides to use a ruse to get into the home. He basically knocks on the door and tells the servant, "I've got medicine for the secretary." Now, the secretary's in bed because he had a carting accident sometime prior and injured some ribs in his neck. And he's inside of a metal brace. The metal brace which would save his life. Powell uses the ruse to get into the house, stating he has medicine for the secretary, and he ends up barging past the servant who answers the door. And he starts climbing the steps. Secretary Seward's son, at the top of the stairs, confronts Powell. "What are you doing?" And Powell tries to talk his way past. "I've got medicine. Hey, the doctor was just here. Who are you?" Powell pulls out a pistol, pulls the trigger, click, nothing happens. So he spins the gun around in his hand and he starts beating the secretary's son over the head with the pistol, to the point where he exposes some of his brains. That's how badly he was beaten. He was beaten into a coma.
An OG pistol whip.
You got it. Powell goes into the bedroom where Seward is in bed, still recuperating, lunges on him and tries to run a knife through him. He's got a long dirk. And the knife is hitting the metal brace, so he can't get through. He's able to, when he tries to cut the secretary's throat, he misses the mark, and he ends up gashing him across the chin and disfigures him. Well, to make a long story short, Powell ends up stabbing four people in the home and pistol whipping the son. He ends up running out of the house. The last person he sees as he's running out of the house, he slashes across the back with his knife. He goes out into the middle of the street and he begins yelling, "I'm mad, I'm mad." And he vanishes. He realizes that Davy Harold took off without him. Harold's gone.
What do you forget?
Now he's got to make it back to Mary Surratt's house.
Correct.
Where he is eventually arrested 3 days later with some of the other co-conspirators. After a trial, and Powell became somewhat famous during the military trial because he was, number one, he was a giant of a man. He was about 6'2", 6'3" in his shoes, at a time when your average man was 5'7", 5'8". So he stood out. There, a lot of journalists wrote about him, how he was stoic and quiet, and he was a giant, and so he was getting somewhat famous. He's convicted along with the other co-conspirators, and on July the 7th, they are taken to the gallows at the D.C. Arsenal, and they are hung. When the trapdoor drops, Powell doesn't die right away. He ends up doing the rope dance. He kicks around on the bottom of the rope, almost to the point where his knees were coming up and touching his chest. That's how bad it was. Mary Surratt, George Azarat, Davy Harold, and Powell all died on that day. And they were all buried right there at the Washington, D.C. Arsenal. Now, the other family members of the other three came and exhumed the bodies. No one claimed Powell's body, so his body was there for a while. And he ends up, somewhere along the line, he's reburied at another cemetery, but his head turns up missing. Someone took the head, and it ends up at the Smithsonian Institute. In 1991, a researcher at the Smithsonian is going through some old Indian bones and that he's trying to catalog, and he finds this skull with markings on it. And he does the research, and he realizes he's holding the skull of Lewis Powell, the Lincoln co-conspirator. And as such, they end up contacting Powell's long distant relatives that are right here in Geneva, Florida. And in 1996, Powell's skull is repatriated back to Florida, and the skull is placed in a small mahogany box. It's buried in Geneva with a full Confederate honor guard, and it rests there to this day. It took about 130 some odd years to get that head back to Florida.
Interesting facts. Bob mentioned Mary Surratt, who was the first female to be executed in the United States. At that time, the public was going mad. They're going crazy. You can't execute a woman here. As a result, as history will show, she was executed. The other thing interesting, short fact about the case in general was, it was tried in a military court under military law, not by a jury of their peers, not in a court, a federal court. It was done by the military. We knew from the beginning in history will show that the outcome was going to be one outcome only, and that was going to be the demise of the conspirators. Which brings us to the missing head ending up here in Florida, in the beautiful city of Geneva. Small town America, ladies and gentlemen. When we take our trip there, it's going to be like going back in time, actually. A couple of little shops in town. There's a Geneva bar in town that we're going to visit. But you're going to see that it's kind of like the South has stood still. Thus, the Confederate flag still at the cemetery, and as we know to date, that is taboo now because of woke America. It's American history, ladies and gentlemen. Regardless if it's dark, regardless of the content, it's part of our history. Bob and I are going to uncover that history. We are not woke. We're going to tell you the way it is. We're not intending to ruffle any feathers, but as historians, Bob and I are going to bring you the facts in the case. And a lot of you don't see a cemetery that's a Confederate cemetery. So some of you are going to see that for the first time. You may have seen it in history books, you may see it, maybe you've seen it in a documentary, but to actually have us walk a Confederate cemetery and point to one of the conspirators and one of the most famous cases in history, you're not going to want to miss it. Bob, are you ready to roll out to the beautiful city of Geneva?
I am.
And Lucky's staying here, right?
Lucky's staying here.
You'll be seeing more of Lucky in following episodes as well. Thanks for tuning in. This episode is going to be available quite shortly. You could see us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. So from Southern Discomfort, from me, my partner Bob, please stay tuned. We'll see you soon. We're getting in the big red truck and we're heading out. Good night. Have a great day.
Folks, we're here in Geneva, Florida, Central Florida, in the Geneva Cemetery, established in 1880. We're standing over the grave of Lewis Powell, whom we talked about earlier. Is Private Lewis Thornton Powell, Confederate Services of America, is born in 1844. Executed on July the 7th, 1865. He served with the 2nd Florida Infantry Company I and with the 43rd Battalion of Virginia Cavalry with Mosby as Rangers. Here, just below the surface, is a small mahogany box containing only Mr. Powell's skull. It was brought here from the Smithsonian in 1996. Just behind us is Lewis's mother, Caroline Powell, born in 1811, and Powell had some family in the area, and they brought his remains back, and here he is now. Like I say, this is an old cemetery. There are 17 Civil War veterans buried amongst us, 15 Confederate, 2 Union. There was 18, but one was removed from this cemetery and buried elsewhere. The family removed them. That was some years back. But as you can see, and we'll pan in a little bit, very old cemetery, cypress oaks all around us, what I call a spider tree that branches grow into the ground.
We're right in the middle of horse country here. Horse ranches you pass coming through. So one interesting thing. So Bob already told you 18 from the Civil War, minus the one. Not one other Confederate flag we found in this whole cemetery.
This is it.
Except for Mr. Powell. Just one. Which could lead you to believe either A, he still has distant relatives here and they take care of the stone, but looking at the flowers, the last time it looks like somebody was here and actually put flowers, so sometime during Christmas, there's poinsettias. Although, the Confederate flag is one of those cheap dollar flags and it's brand spanking new. So somebody is paying homage and tribute to Mr. Powell.
Now, the town where I come from, just a little further to the north, they've got 12 Civil War veterans buried there during the riots. A little bit prior to that, the Confederate flag blew up, like some old states.
I blew nothing. Gonna look, ain't got the time. I'm a wheelchair every alive and dead, waiting to die.
Throw from Orlando, and you would never know it. You would never think that you were anywhere near Orlando. This is the Old South. This is Southern Discomfort, to quote the name of the show. Getting back to Mr. Powell, we spoke about the journey. We spoke about his skull being in the Smithsonian. Somebody locates it and says, look at this. It's one of the conspirators. It's Corporal Powell. They get a hold of that family here in Geneva, and then that famous mahogany box that Bob talks about is buried right where we're standing. No disrespect to Mr. Powell, Mr. Powell's family. The box is right beneath the headstone. Remember, the most famous case in history, not the most famous conspirator.
And ironically, a story told about Powell, some believe it, some don't. I tend not to believe it, that after one of his first battles of the Civil War, he supposedly cut the head off of a Union soldier and then used the skull to stub out his cigars. That's one of the legends. It's on Wikipedia. Take that for what you will. I tend not to believe it. I just can't imagine a soldier dragging a skull still with the flesh on it. You'd have to bury it with the insects, or have it defleshed in some manner. Can't imagine him putting it in his knapsack and the other soldiers around him not kicking him out of the camp or something. But
let me play devil's advocate.
Okay.
All right. Bob is probably 98% correct that it didn't happen. You look at history from before Jesus had his sandals, and warriors had taken some type of souvenirs from some of their kills. World War II, the Americans used to cut off the Japanese ears and put them on their dog tag. So they used to have a string of ears on their dog tags. You know about scalping, the American Indians used to do the same thing. But if you look in history, not to change subject, if you look at some of the serial killers that Bob and I have worked personally, not only the big famous ones, they take souvenirs. I'm not going to talk about those until we get into some other cases, but I tend to think that he was crazy enough. First off, the legend is cool, right? Secondly, he was crazy enough to do this, especially with being with Mosby's Rangers. They were a guerrilla warfare operating unit. They didn't play by the rules. They didn't do basic training the way the rest of the Confederate and Union soldiers did. They were not a ragtag bunch. So Bob, not that I would argue with you, but I kind of tend that it could have happened. just because of history.
I think it's legend building, but you could be right. Just one side note. It wasn't uncommon in the 1700s or 1800s for people to steal the body parts of famous or infamous people. Pancho Villa's skull was stolen from his grave. Geronimo's skull was stolen from his grave. Shakespeare's skull is missing, supposedly. And Osceola, the famous Indian chief, when they exhumed his body, his skull was missing.
St. Augustine.
Yeah.
But they know who had it.
He was in, I think he was in Moultrie, South Carolina. He was imprisoned at St. Augustine at the fort.
Yes, he was.
And then later on he died in South Carolina, and when they exhumed his body, his skull was missing.
And a lieutenant at the fort where he was being incarcerated actually stole the head and placed it in a jar in his home to scare his kids into doing what he wanted them to do, and not to misbehave. That's documented. The skull went several different places. So, like Bob said, it is absolutely not unusual for certain body parts to come up missing.
And Powell, back in 1865, was very famous. His fame has somewhat, I should say infamous, his fame or infamy has somewhat diminished over the years. People remember John Wilkes Booth. They don't so much remember Lewis Powell. At the time, William Seward, the Secretary of State, whom Powell was assigned to kill, was very hated in the South, had once given a speech where he stated the Democrat Party should be dislodged from the Union. A lot of hatred towards Seward. So when Powell made the attempt on Seward's life, he was a hero to a lot of people. And like we said earlier, during the trial, he was very stoic, very quiet. He was a giant of a man, and the newspaper writers kind of fell in love with the guy. So from Washington, D.C., where he was hanged, to the Smithsonian, to here, this is where his journey ended. What do you think about bringing Lewis up for a drink?
We are going to end our first episode. We are going to have a drink with Mr. Lewis. Stay tuned, 2 seconds, they'll be on. We're going to be hitting more places. There's some great stories that are going to start coming up. We may go into a serial killer next. We're absolutely going to make our trails to St. Augustine. It's not that big, huge, oh my God, beautiful tourist area. It has a really, really dark past. We're going to get into some of St. Augustine's dark path with civil rights. Chief Osceola we're going to speak about when we get up there, and some other things. I think the more that you stay tuned, the more intrigued you'll be, the more you're going to want to watch us. The serial killers and whatnot are just extremely interesting. Some of them you never heard of. And when you hear the first case we're going to do, you're absolutely going to go, I never knew that occurred. It's bizarre. It's barbaric. That's going to be our next stop. That being said, I'm Bobby Caruso.
I'm Bob Walker.
This has been Southern Discomfort. Unfortunately, Lucky couldn't be here today.
He'll be here at the next episode.
He'll be here at our next episode.
If a hawk doesn't nail him.
Yeah. We are in the South. I'd like to thank some of our sponsors. If you want to sponsor us, please hit us up either on Facebook or on Instagram if you're interested in sponsoring the show. We're going to try to get a lot bigger than we are here coming down the pipe. So I'd like to thank New Addiction Tattoo. Shout out to Justin. Shout out to my cigar brand, Hitman Cigars. They're amazing. They're delicious. It's usually a cigar Bobby and I always smoke. We don't have one in our mouth right now. It's disrespectful. We didn't want to smoke in the cemetery.
Got a cigar for Lewis?
I may have a cigar for Mr. Lewis. We'll see in just a few minutes. Please hit likes, hit subscribe. Tell us what you want to see. Maybe you know of a case that Bob and I have not familiar with or we haven't handled. Maybe there's a legend in your family that you want us to know about. We'll be more than happy to come to you, do an interview, and see where we go from there. So from Southern Discomfort, have a great day. Make memories. Or if the memories you have are dark, make them light. We're going to have a drink with Mr. Lewis. You ready, Bob?
I am.
Pop the cork.
All right. How long did it run? Look at the time. Southern Discomfort. Nothing scripted. We just show up and wing it. See you at the next episode. It's too hot to be digging, dude.
It is. It's a balmy 95 degrees here in Florida. There's no breeze. It's just sweat. So like we told you from the beginning, we were going to uncover and dig up the South's past. Be it dark, it is still history. What about a send-off, Bob?
Yeah, we thought we'd bring Lewis up for one last drink. The drink he did not receive on the gallows on July the 7th, 1865. We figured maybe give him a send-off drink and maybe one of your cigars, and then
Absolutely.
don't worry.
Absolutely.
Don't make any phone calls. Don't call the police. We're going to put him back. We promise, folks. See you at the next episode.
Take it easy, everybody. Stay safe. Make memories.